The last thing Mayday carried was a crate of armor for the men replacing him. He was a clone commando holding an Imperial supply depot on Barton 4, and there were 3 of them left in a building sized for a garrison. Not 3 squads, 3. The perimeter sensors had been dead for months, and every request he filed to repair them came back denied. So raiders helped themselves whenever the weather allowed, and when they took a shipment, Command sent him up a mountain in a storm to bring it back. He brought it back. He opened it. Inside were helmets, white, unscuffed, still packed, sized for someone else. Between the clones standing in formation at the end of the war and the soldiers standing in that corridor 19 years later, the galaxy did not lose an army. It wrote one off. There is a document under all of this. It has 5 lines. Every line carries a signature, and by the end of this, you will know all 5.
The last of those lines ends with a man named Nax, sitting on a street on Dayu, holding his own helmet upside down, asking strangers for the price of a warm meal. We are not starting with him. We finish with him, and with the question of who owes him. Start instead with the paperwork Mayday kept filing. That is the detail I cannot get past. A man in a collapsing outpost, with 2 brothers left and a perimeter he could not see past, still filling out requisitions to a chain of command that had already stopped reading them. He was not naive. He had fought a war and watched it end and been posted here. And he still behaved as though the system had obligations to him, because that was the only way he had ever been taught to behave. Lieutenant Nolan ran the depot from the warm side of it. His position on clones was that they were used equipment, and he said so, and he also blamed Mayday for the stolen cargo, and for the men Mayday had lost holding it. Those 2 ideas do not fit together, and nobody made him fit them. You do not hold equipment responsible. You replace it. No one wanted the accounting of a machine and the accountability of a soldier, and the Empire had built a category of person where you could have both. So Mayday went up the mountain. The avalanche came down on him, and a clone called Crosshair dug him out and carried him back through the snow to the only medical bay for light years, and Nolan would not spend the supplies. A medic, he said, would be a waste. Mayday died on the floor of a building he had defended for months, next to crates he had just retrieved for the Empire, containing the gear of the men who would stand where he had stood. What he said before that was this: "We are good soldiers. We followed orders. And for what?" Nolan's summary, delivered afterwards without any particular heat, was that Mayday had been expendable. I want to be precise about that word, because it is not an insult, and it was not meant as one. Expendable is an accounting term. It describes stock you are not expected to recover, written down in advance, budgeted as a loss before the loss occurs. Somebody had already put clones in that column, on paper, years earlier. A lieutenant freezing on a supply rock does not invent a category like that. He inherits it. And the man who wrote it did his arithmetic on a rainy landing platform in the first days after the war, with the Jedi barely cold. There is one sentence spoken on a rain-lashed landing platform on Kamino, within days of the war ending, that does more to the clones than the bombardment ever will. Lama Su had raised the matter of the contracts, politely, the way a supplier raises an invoice. The agreement stipulated continued production, and Tarkin, who had not come all that way to be reminded of anything, told him that those contracts had been with the Republic, and the Republic no longer existed. Sit with what that sentence concedes. It concedes that the Grand Army was never an institution of the Republic in the way a navy belongs to a nation. It was a purchase. There was a buyer, a vendor, a delivery schedule, and terms. And the useful thing about a purchase, if you are the buyer, is that you can walk away from it by changing your letterhead. The arithmetic behind the walkaway was simple enough that Tarkin said it out loud. Conscripted soldiers, he told the Kaminoans, could provide the same service at half the cost. He was right. A Kaminoan clone took roughly 10 years to reach the line. 10 years of tanks and nutrients and instructors and flash training. All of it paid for years before the soldier fired a shot. A recruit costs a poster and a boot camp. If your job is a budget, this is not a hard call.
And the argument's honesty is exactly what makes it dangerous, because everything cruel that follows can be justified by an accountant who is simply not wrong. Meanwhile, the facility around them was still running. Somewhere below that platform, the tanks were full and on schedule. 200,000 units delivered years ago, and 1 million more promised. An entire industrial process with nobody left at the far end of it who intended to pay. Lama Su tried the only pitch a vendor has, which is quality. Clones are more skilled, he said, more accurate than any recruit. Tarkin said he would be the judge of that, and the conversation was over. And a species that had built its whole economy on one customer had just been informed that the customer had dissolved himself. That is line 1 of the write-off, and it is the shortest line in the document. Price. No debate, no vote, no committee, no announcement. One officer with a figure in his head, standing in the rain, deciding that the men who had just handed him the galaxy were a recurring expense the new owner did not intend to carry. Everything after this is the paperwork of making that decision look like something else. Because he had a problem, and it was not a moral one. You cannot switch off 1 million trained soldiers and hand their post to farm boys with 2 weeks of drill. Somebody has to teach the farm boys. Somebody who has done the job, in the field, under fire, and who is standing right there, already on the payroll, and already scheduled for deletion. The first 1,000 stormtroopers in the galaxy were taught to shoot by the men they had been built to replace. The school was on Daro, in the Outer Rim, hidden well enough that the Senate funding it had no idea it existed. 50 clone commandos ran the training. Not clerks, not washouts, not the ones too old for the field. Commandos, the most expensive soldiers the Republic ever produced, each one the end product of 10 years and a war, standing on a range in the Empire's first year, correcting the grip of a farm kid from somewhere they had never heard of. Rampart, who built the program, was open about the reasoning, and it is worth hearing in his own framing rather than mine. A recruit chooses to serve. A clone was grown to. The Empire, he argued, would rather have the man who volunteered than the man who could not have done otherwise. And if the volunteer was worse at the job, that was survivable, because the supply of volunteers was endless. So the clones were not being honored with a teaching post. They were being drained. Everything the Republic had paid 10 years to install in those men was being copied out of them and into stock that cost a fraction as much. And the moment the copying finished, the original had no function left. You strip the asset before you write it down. That is not cruelty, it is procedure. And it is much worse than cruelty, because nobody involved has to feel anything. At least one of them refused to keep going. Gregor, a commando captain assigned to Daro, ran, and got out only because the Bad Batch happened to be in the building on other business. 1 in 50. I am not going to pretend that number proves anything about the other 49, because I do not know what they were told or what they thought they were doing. Half of you are typing the obvious defense right now, which is that they had no choice, that a soldier follows orders and there was nowhere on Daro to go. Hold that thought. Keep it exactly as it is. In about 20 minutes, the Emperor is going to stand in the Senate and say the same sentence you are about to type in the comments, and he is going to use it as an argument for throwing them away. There is a detail here that I find harder to shake than the training itself. The unit that proved the whole concept to Tarkin, the elite squad of non-clone recruits whose success sold the program upstairs, was commanded by a clone. And while all this was running, before any vote, before any debate, the Empire was already stockpiling the new armor at supply depots across the galaxy. One of those depots was on Barton 4. The crates were in the snow before the law existed. That is line 2 of the write-off. Not their lives yet, and not their freedom. Their necessity. By the time anyone in the Senate was asked to vote on anything, the thing being voted on had already been built, staffed, tested, and warehoused. If you want the remaining 3 lines, subscribe, because this is the part where it stops being about soldiers at all. Which left Rampart 1 exposure. As long as the tanks on Kamino were still filling, any admiral with a budget could undo the whole thing with a single order. The weather report was ready before the weather was. When Tipoca City went into the sea, the galaxy was told that a cataclysmic storm had done it, and the story was in circulation fast, cleanly, with no visible seam. No surviving document tells us when that sentence was drafted. What the record shows is how little friction it met, and an explanation that smooth, arriving that quickly about a planet nobody visits, is not a reaction to an event. It is a component of one. The order itself ran down a chain built with the same care. Palpatine wanted it. Tarkin carried it to Rampart and authorized him to proceed once the early phases came off. At no point does anyone at the top touch anything you could photograph. The Emperor speaks to a Moff, the Moff speaks to a Vice Admiral, and the Vice Admiral speaks to gunnery officers, and every link in that chain is a man who could plausibly have exceeded his instructions. That design pays out later, and it pays out exactly as designed.
When the evidence eventually surfaced, Palpatine denounced the attack as the rogue act of one officer, and the galaxy accepted it, because the structure had been assembled to make that sentence available from the beginning. A system where the man at the bottom can be disowned at any moment is not a system that has failed. It is a system doing the job it was built for. Rampart understood his own position in it better than anyone gives him credit for. There is a moment where a clone officer, Captain Wilco, knows something that contradicts a report Rampart has already filed, and Rampart is offered the ordinary solution, which is to amend the paperwork. He refuses. He says he will not falsify an official report. Then he shoots Wilco, and the report remains accurate. It is not that he lied. It is that he did not. He treated the document as the thing with integrity, and the man standing next to it as the variable you adjust to keep the document true. And if you want one image for how the Empire handled clones in this period, it is that one. Not hatred. Bookkeeping with a sidearm. Which leaves one awkward stage in an operation that already has its alibi written. Before you can drown a planet, somebody has to sit down with a manifest and decide what goes on the transports. Equipment, obviously. Data. Personnel, some of them. That list survives. And you can read the Empire's entire opinion of the clone army in what is on it, and in what is not. Read the manifest as a ranking, because that is what it is. Off the platforms first went the cloning technology itself, the machinery, the templates, the process. Then the scientists who knew how to operate it. Then the cadets, the ones still small enough to be described as inventory rather than personnel. Then a quantity of clone troopers, because trained bodies still had a resale value that year. Everything on that list has one thing in common. It is all future output. Not one item on it is a man who had already fought the war. The rest of Kamino stayed where it was. 3 Venator-class Star Destroyers came in over Tipoca City and opened up on the domes, and then on the catwalks, and then on the stilts holding the whole thing above the water, which is the detail that gets me, because the stilts are not a military target. You shell the supports when you do not intend to come back. The city came apart and went down into an ocean it had spent centuries standing over, and most of the Kaminoan species went down with it, and the survivors are scattered across the galaxy in numbers small enough to count. Lama Su was arrested. The charge, more or less, was that he had attempted to evacuate Kaminoan scientists, which is precisely what the Empire had spent the previous hours doing, and the only difference between the crime and the operation was the question of who the scientists were going to belong to afterwards. He finished on Coruscant, in a cell, the head of a government whose planet was now weather and wreckage. Nala Se, the chief scientist, was not imprisoned. She was relocated to a world called Wayland and put back to work inside an Imperial cloning program. Remember that name. She is going to be sitting in that laboratory for 18 years while everyone else in this story is being dismantled. And when we come back to her at the end, the question of what she was actually building there is going to reframe every line of the document we are reading. That is line 3 of the write-off. Production. Not the clones themselves, but the possibility of ever wanting more of them. As long as those tanks were filling, any officer with an appropriation could reverse the entire policy in an afternoon. And so, the policy was made physically irreversible before it was ever made legal. Nothing about the sequence is accidental. Replacements trained, then armor warehoused, then the factory drowned.
and only after all three is anyone in government asked their opinion. Somewhere in all of this, nobody drew up a list for the men already in the field. There was no manifest for the ones holding depots and garrisons and checkpoints across the galaxy. No line item, no relocation, no schedule. They were not evacuated, and they were not killed. They simply were not on the paperwork, which is a specific kind of nothing. And one of them is going to end up on a street on Daro with his helmet in his hands. The Senate was told about the storm. Two clones who had been in the sky over Tipoca City that night, watching the guns of their own fleet work, knew what the storm actually was. And they were still alive. And they were on Coruscant, and one of them had decided he was going to say so. Both of them had about a week to live. Cade had nothing left to trade except what he had seen, and he decided to spend it. He was a clone trooper who had been in the sky over Kamino on the night the guns opened up, and he knew there had been no storm. And on Coruscant, that knowledge was the only thing he still owned that anybody wanted. Men in his position do not usually go to the press, out of principle. They go because the alternative is being nothing at all, and testimony was the last job description available to him. He talked to the wrong person, or the right one, in a cantina, and a shot came through the room and killed him at the table. His friend Slip, serial number CT-0409, survived the same evening. Slip had been there too. Slip knew that the order to bombard the Kaminoan cities had come from Rampart, by name, and now Slip was the only man alive who could say it out loud, which made him for about a week the most consequential clone in the galaxy, and also the most disposable. Rex found him first, because by this point, Rex had built a quiet apparatus for finding clones nobody else was looking for, and Senator Rio Chuchi agreed to meet. Two of them in a room, a soldier with a memory and a politician with a seat on the committee, which is as close as this story ever gets to a functioning institution. The assassin got him there. Slip died in front of the one person in the Senate who was trying to help him, and the case against Rampart lost its last living voice inside a fortnight. Then Rex got a look at the man doing the killing, and it was a clone. Same template, same face, same manufactured obedience, turned around and pointed at the men it came from. I do not want to oversell this as irony, because irony is too comfortable a word. It is procurement. The Empire needed clone witnesses removed, and it had, sitting on its books, a supply of assets specifically engineered to carry out instructions without asking what the instructions were for, and using them cost nothing, and left no trail leading anywhere except back into the same expiring product line. Two men were killed to protect a lie about a storm, weeks before any law had been passed, at a point when the Empire's official position was still that it valued its clone soldiers. Chuchi got the proof anyway. Not from the dead, in the end, but from the ship. Rampart's own Venator had recorded its own guns, the way every Star Destroyer does, and that log ended up in her hands, and she carried it into the Imperial Senate to end a man's career and force a vote she was certain she would win. She was right about the career. She was wrong about everything else, and the men who died getting her that recording bought the Empire the best afternoon it had had all year. The same sentence was spoken twice in that chamber inside 10 minutes. The first time it was a defense. The second time it was a removal order against an army of more than 3 million people. Here is how the afternoon actually ran. The recording plays. The Senate watches Rampart's own Star Destroyers put Tipoca City into the ocean, with the storm story still hanging in the air above them, and Grand Vizier Masa Mayday calls it an unprovoked and cowardly attack, and shock troopers come down the aisle. Rampart, being marched out in front of the entire galactic government, says the only thing he has, which is that he was following orders. Nobody in the room disagrees with him. They just do not care, because his usefulness has changed shape. Then the Emperor takes the floor, and thanks Senator Chuchi. That is the part I keep coming back to. He commends her, publicly, for her diligence in exposing a rogue element within the military. And the compliment is real in the sense that she has just handed him something he could not have manufactured himself without risk. And having thanked her, he makes his argument.
The clones under that officer's command, he says, followed his orders blindly. They did what they were told. An army that does what it is told, regardless of what it is told, cannot be trusted with the security of the galaxy. Sit with the shape of that. Obedience was not a defect the clones developed. It was the specification. It was written into the purchase, grown into the men. And when growing, it turned out to be insufficiently reliable, installed as hardware in their skulls by the same government now expressing concern about it. Palpatine spent a decade and a war making certain those men would execute any order handed down, tested it on the Jedi, and then stood up in front of the Senate and cited the result as grounds for disposal. Rampart says he followed orders, and it is an excuse. The clones followed orders, and it is a diagnosis. Half of you have been holding a defense of them since the training camps, which was that they had no choice, that they were built this way, that refusing was never an option. You are right. Keep going with it, all the way to the end of the thought, because that is Palpatine's argument too. He is not disputing your position, he is agreeing with it and drawing the opposite conclusion. And the clones who did break the conditioning, who pulled the chip out and ran, were hunted as deserters. Comply, and you are unfit. Refuse, and you are a fugitive. There was no third door, and the building had been designed that way from the floor plan up. The bill passed. The Empire announced a new era, an army of enlisted men, and the word stormtrooper stopped being a description of clones in white armor and started being a job you could apply for. That is line 4 of the write-off, and it is the only line with witnesses. Their right to serve, taken by a vote, in public, on the record, on the strength of a virtue. Tell me in the comments who in that chamber could realistically have voted the other way, and what you think it would have changed. Because Chuchi did win something in that bill. She had fought for months to get provisions attached to it, pensions and support, and a place to land for men with nowhere to go. It went in. Now find me one clone who ever received it. More than 3 million of them were made. The simple question is where they went, and the honest answer is that the record does not say. The provisions Chuchi fought for went into the bill and then went nowhere, and the mechanism of that is almost funny. She had extracted the promise from Rampart in exchange for her support, in a negotiation between two people who each thought they were using the other. By the time the bill passed, Rampart was in custody, disowned by the Emperor, a non-person. The obligation survived him on paper. The owner of it did not, and an obligation with nobody attached to it is a piece of stationery. What we know for certain is the shape of the disappearance. Within a decade, the clone was a rarity in the ranks, a curiosity, an old face under a helmet nobody recognized, while enlisted troopers filled the corps in numbers no cloning facility could ever have matched. There is no mass grave in this story. There is no camp. There is a slow, statistical evaporation, and archives that simply stop mentioning a category of person. And I think that absence is the finding rather than a gap in it. A discharged citizen leaves a paper trail because a state owes him things. Written off stock does not generate documents. It generates a blank space where documents would be, and the blank space is the receipt. One glimpse survives, and it is worth the whole missing archive. On a captured Jedi outpost called Brighthome, 2 clones in white armor, Ding and Kicker, are working through the confiscated property of the Order, logging it, boxing it, bored out of their minds, cataloging, making an inventory of the dead. Then Darth Vader comes through the hangar, and they raise their weapons at a man they do not recognize, thinking there might be a commendation in it, and he kills them both with a gesture, without slowing down, and without a word about who they are. Consider the arrangement in that room. The clones are inventorying the Jedi they were used to destroy, on behalf of an empire that is inventorying them, and the man who does the killing is the last Jedi any of them ever took orders from. Nobody planned that as a symbol. It is just what the job looked like from inside, on an average shift, in the years when nothing was happening to them officially. Somewhere, in the same period, on a street on Daiyu, a man from the 501st is sitting with his back against a wall.
He fought in the war that made all of this possible. He is entitled, on paper, to support that was voted through the Senate. Nobody has ever contacted him about it, and nobody ever will, and he has worked out a use for his helmet. I said we would finish with him, and we will. First, there are 3 men who refuse to wait for the paperwork, and what happened to them is the closest thing this story has to an answer. Cody took his helmet off. Crosshair kept his on. They were on Desix together, sent to recover an imperial governor from insurgents, and Cody did the thing he had learned in a war he mostly won, by talking as often as shooting. He removed his helmet in front of the woman holding the hostage, showed her his face, and offered to end it without anyone dying. She accepted. The hostage walked free, and the imperial governor, safe, brushed down, restored to his office, immediately ordered her shot in the back. Cody refused. Crosshair did it. What Cody says around this is the closest a clone ever comes to a philosophy in the whole record. Clones are not droids. A droid executes and a clone decides. And whichever way he decides, he is the one who has to carry it afterwards. He says this to Crosshair, on a transport, in the flat voice of a man working something out that he would rather not be working out. Shortly afterwards, Commander Cody, the officer who took Utapau and handed Obi-Wan Kenobi his lightsaber back on a cliff edge, walked away from the Imperial Army and was gone. Crosshair stayed. He stayed through everything, and he was still staying on a frozen supply depot on Barton 4 on the day a commando called Mayday was pulled out of an avalanche and carried down a mountain on his back. You know the rest of that afternoon. Crosshair asked for a medic. Lieutenant Nolan decided the supplies were better spent elsewhere, and then, standing over the body, explained that Mayday had been expendable, and that Crosshair would be too, if he kept talking. So Crosshair shot him. Not for Mayday, exactly, and not out of any conversion to a cause. He shot him because after 4 years of being told he was different from his brothers, he had finally been shown the paperwork, and his name was in the same column. They arrested him and shipped him to a mountain on a planet called Wayland, which is where the last line of the write-off leads, and it is the only line with no document behind it at all. Line 5 is the men themselves, disposed of one at a time, quietly, with no vote, no announcement, and no register. Some deserted, like Cody. Some were declared dead and used the death, like Rex, who turned an imperial clerical error into a resistance network and spent years pulling brothers out of service and cutting the chips out of their skulls in back rooms. Most did neither, because most people do neither, and the ones who did neither are the ones the record loses. And a portion of them, the ones politely described as decommissioned, went where Crosshair went. Not to a settlement, not to a pension office, into a facility inside a mountain run by a doctor with a research budget and a very specific requirement for clone bodies. Before I tell you what was being done in there and what it was ultimately for, we need to deal with the 3 objections you have been assembling since the 2nd chapter. All 3 of them are reasonable. One of them is even true. The Empire's side of this can be argued, and one part of it is simply correct. Clones aged at twice the rate of an ordinary man. That was designed in, deliberately, because a soldier who takes 20 years to become useful is not a weapon. He is a school. The consequence arrives on schedule. A clone who was combat ready at 10 was middle-aged at 20 and worn out at 30. And the men voting on that bill were looking at gray-haired veterans in their early teens. On top of that, the source material was failing. Jango Fett's genetic sample had been stretched and copied and stretched again until the Kaminoans themselves were worried about it, which is precisely why a pure first-generation clone became so valuable to them. The product line was dying without any help from the Senate. All of which explains why you would stop ordering. It explains nothing else. Aging stock does not require you to shell the support stilts of a city so it cannot be rebuilt. It does not require 2 witnesses shot inside a fortnight on Coruscant. It does not require veterans to be shipped to a laboratory in a mountain. A company that discontinues a product does not usually burn down its supplier's civilization on the way out, and the gap between the reasonable argument and the actual behavior is the whole subject of this video. The older continuity handled it completely differently, and it is worth knowing. In Legends, there was no single decision at all. Kamino was lost roughly 12 years before Yavin. The Empire ran its own cloning on Coruscant and Centax II, using Sparty cylinders that produced fast, cheap, poor-quality men. Human recruitment ramped up around 9 years before Yavin, and by the Death Star run, about a third of the troopers in white armor were still Fett clones. 20 years of silt. No vote, no villain, no document. Just an institution slowly changing its mind.
I find that version more plausible, and this one more damning. And I would like to know which of those two you think is the more honest account of how things like this actually happen. Some of you have been sitting on a third objection since the first minute, which is that these men machine-gunned their own generals and hunted children through a temple, and whatever they got afterwards, they had it coming. They did do that. I am not going to soften it. But look at where the bill landed. The man who gave the order died as Emperor of the Galaxy, and even that turned out to be negotiable. The Moff who did the arithmetic went on to build the largest weapon in history and put his name on it. The officer who pressed the button was arrested and eventually died in a laboratory arguing about data. And the men who physically pulled the triggers, with a piece of hardware in their skulls installed specifically to guarantee they could not do otherwise, are the ones who ended up on the pavement on Daiyu with their helmets turned over. The punishment in this story was distributed in almost perfect inverse proportion to the responsibility, which leaves the hole in the reasonable argument, and it is large enough to be visible from orbit. If the clone program was shut down because cloning had become an expensive dead end, then somebody needs to explain why the finest cloner alive was still drawing an imperial salary 18 years later inside a mountain with a research budget and a supply of bodies. Nala Se closed her hand around the detonator while Rampart was still talking. They were standing in her laboratory inside a mountain on Wayland, 18 years after she had watched him drown her civilization, and he had come to her because he needed something she had. He wanted the Necromancer data. He wanted a bargaining chip good enough to buy himself back into the Empire that had thrown him away. And he had already shot her once, and she was going to die in that room regardless, so she made a decision about what would leave the room with her. Everything she knew went up with him. The last cloner of Kamino took the science of Kamino out of the galaxy, personally. Now, the thing she was destroying, Project Necromancer, was Royce Hemlock's work, run out of the Advanced Science Division at Tantus, and its purpose was to enrich a living body's blood with midichlorians, while keeping that body's own genetic identity intact. In plain terms, to build a vessel that could hold the Force. The raw material was clones. That is what the polite word decommissioned had been covering all along, and it is why the transports ran to a mountain instead of a settlement. A child called Omega turned out to have blood that made the process work, which is the only reason any of it went anywhere. Palpatine came to that base in person. He walked those corridors, approved the work himself, and told Hemlock there was a ministry waiting for him if it succeeded. So the clone program was never shut down. The Empire stopped buying an army and started paying for a body. 3 million soldiers were written off to fund the manufacture of exactly one man, and that man was the one who signed the write-off. When the mountain finally fell, Tarkin took what was left of the budget and moved it into Project Stardust, and the money the galaxy had spent on soldiers became a weapon that requires none. The same officer who priced them at half cost on a rainy platform in Chapter 1 signed both ends of it. Elsewhere, quietly, a commandant named Brendel Hux picked up the files and kept going. And the line runs on, past the fall of the Empire, all the way to a voice that had no business speaking again. Which brings me back to a man sitting on a street on Daiyu, 9 years before Yavin. His name was Nax. He served in the 501st. He still wore what was left of the armor, and there was shrapnel in his right leg that nobody was ever going to take out. He held his helmet upside down in both hands.
Obi-Wan Kenobi, a general of the army Nax had belonged to, walked past, dropped credits into it, and kept moving. And neither of them said anything worth recording. And that is the entire relationship between the Republic and the men it grew. I promised you 5 lines and the name at the bottom of each. Price, signed by Tarkin. Necessity, signed by Rampart. Production, signed by Rampart on Tarkin's authority. The right to serve, signed by the Senate at the Emperor's request. 4 different hands, one man standing behind all 4, and it worked because each of them only ever had to sign 1 line. The 5th line has no signature at all. Nobody put their name to what happened to Nax, because nothing happened to Nax. That was the whole design. The last thing Mayday carried was a crate of armor for the men replacing him. He thought he was recovering stolen Imperial property in a storm. He was carrying his own write-off up a mountain, and it was heavy, and he brought it all the way back.